Welcome to Om Times TV, a division of Om Times Media and Broadcasting. What happens in the sky affects life down here on Earth. The Celestial Compass shows you how
to pursue it seriously. And so I enrolled in Kepler College and got my certifications, started those in 2012. And then I just kind of went from there, hosting people in my house to talk about astrology until it became kind of a business on its own.
Brief footnote, Cosmos and Psyche is written by Rick Tarnas, for those of you out there who are wondering and who haven't run into this marvelous tome yet. So at some point you were out in LA working for a while, right?
Yeah, I moved from the southeast and out into LA in the late 90s, and I was there for a long time, and then finally moved to Nashville in 2016.
And I would imagine you didn't have to keep your interest in astrology particularly undercover out in LA, or am I making an assumption here?
No, yeah, it was definitely it's interesting because I worked for the Los Angeles Times, and all my social media was journalism. All my colleagues, all my public self was this kind of, intellectual person. I did not really, it took me a really long time to kind of come out as an astrologer. And I honestly think that Neptune moving into Pisces was my big moment. I have some Pisces placements because, it just gradually became undeniable that this was going to be a big part of my life. And I took a big leap of faith and was like, I'm just going to risk being a weirdo. And the cool thing is, I ended up getting a lot of clients who are journalists and writers. Some of my old colleagues from the Times, became clients. So it was a nice, and I never really got any kind of weird response from my intellectual people. And not that astrologers aren't intellectual by any stretch, but the journalists didn't really have anything to say about it that wasn't supportive. So that was cool.
This reson I can identify with so much of this because my background is as an attorney.
Oh, wow.
And I was undercover for a long time.
Yeah, so
with
you get
this.
that.
And my metaphysical clients knew I was attorney. Very few of my attorney clients knew that I did this kind of stuff. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I completely get it. Well, I really appreciate it. So the intellectual approach also dovetails with something that I love to do, which is not just looking at the moment, but doing the research and seeing everything in astrology is a cycle, and looking at what happened the last time this was here, and do we see trends, and are there archetypes, or what's going on. So the focus of our conversation, I'm hoping, will just be Chiron in Aries, because you have a marvelous treatment of this in your Substack. Chiron is something that wasn't around. I will age myself here. When I was first starting, well, it wasn't paid much attention to when I was first starting to study astrology, because I believe it was discovered in 77.
Right.
Like that. Right. So it wasn't until at some point in the 90s that it worked its way more into conversation, and only recently something that pretty much everybody, well, I can think, I have one colleague that has nasty words to say about it. It's a ball of ice, but everybody else pretty much pays attention to it. So let's start with what is it? It's an asteroid, correct? A dwarf planet?
Yeah, it's an asteroid in that, is it the Cooper belt in between? Let me pull my article to reference it because I had it written in a really kind of a clear way. But yeah, it was discovered in 1977. Let me pull this so I can speak more intellectually about it. Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, so it was one of the first objects discovered in the asteroid belt between the Sun and Saturn on November 1st, 1977. So it is a block of ice probably, but it's also considered a planetoid. So, whatever you want to do with that, and it happens to have a really strong signature in the United States chart. So what was interesting to me about it was that we were going through this eclipse cycle at the same time that as a nation we were going through a Chiron return. And so knowing that, the United States is like going through such a cataclysmic moment and has been for a while now, I really wanted to dig into what has happened in the past. We're a pretty young country, so we haven't had that many Chiron returns because it takes so long.
50 years for those
Yeah.
listening along.
So
Chiron has a 50-year cycle, basically.
yeah, so it gave us kind of a narrow window that I could dig into research wise, and it didn't take very long to find, to scratch the surface and see there were some really big moments historically that coincided with the Chiron return in the past to help, and it kind of helped make sense of, why things are so unstable, uncertain, and even polarized now.
Let's break Chiron down just a little bit before we get into the juicy details,
Sure.
which I happen to think are incredible. The myth of Chiron.
Yes. So the myth of Chiron is related to the wise and noble centaur, a master healer. Chiron was known in Greek mythology to kind of be that teacher, mentor, guru to the heroes. And he was a very tragic figure. The story around Chiron is that he exchanged his own immortality to save Prometheus from infinite torture, but ends up dying from his own unhealed wounds. So in the individual chart, we look at Chiron to kind of explain where we feel the most wounded, but also contain kind of the medicine for our own healing and recovery. And it can also be a place where we learn to mentor others once we kind of go through our own, I think of once we go through our own Chiron return, really, we can get in touch with our own inner mentor because we've gone through that cycle of reconciliation with the inner wounding.
I've heard an explanation that really has helped me a lot with my clients of the mythic character giving up his immortality to gain release from the pain, being a symbol for mastering, sinking fully into the physicality of life and mastering it.
Interesting.
There could be some of that as well. So Chiron in someone's chart can be the abiding wound, the area where you keep working on something, and no matter how much you work, this issue is still here.
Right.
And right now, Chiron's in the sign of Aries, which is highly evolved shoot from the hip energy. Very bold.
Yeah.
I think so. Chiron's been in Aries since 2018, and it's going to be there till 2027.
Yes.
So we're nearing the end of that time. But Chiron and Aries, just some keywords for how this shows up.
Well, I think of Aries, as the divine self. It's the place where we have the audacity to be who we really are, to be bold, to be, forthright and fearless in our identities. But with Chiron here, all of that becomes sort of questioned, becomes insecure, becomes a place of suffering and vulnerability. So I think of that Chiron as sort of a fraud in Aries, a fraud complex, a place where we are struggling to feel entitled, struggling to feel, that we have the right to be here, that we have the right to stand on our own, to be that individual. So that's kind of my interpretation of Chiron and Aries. I don't know what your insight might be.
I have, just based on what I've been witnessing, I see a large streak of toxic masculinity, of out of balance, aggressive, warlike, bullying behavior, which I think,
agree. Yeah.
yeah.
And I almost wonder with that, I always think of that as like the response to being insecure, the response to not really feeling confident in your masculinity. So you have to overdo it. You have to, get there first to prove something. So it's kind of like that insecurity is driving the aggression almost.
Would not argue. So the United States has Chiron in Aries in its chart. This is part of our national character.
Yes, yes. And it happens to be opposite Saturn and square the sun, it's square the sun. So it really is a big part of the United States story, of being, I think of it as like showing up, or at least trying to be that righteous, because I use the Sagittarius rising chart, showing up as being on the side of justice and fighting for, the right thing. But on the other hand, there's a lot more underlying here in the United States chart that feels um, a little manipulative and not quite truthful about what the real reason, what the real motivations are for, the way that the United States tries to um, basically start things around the world. I think that the Chiron plays a role as it is insecure in its role. I mean, it's one of the youngest countries, and it's always kind of trying to demonstrate that it is the leader and has that ability to, fight for the right thing, fight for justice and democracy. But when you look at Chiron and its alignment to the sun, it makes me wonder about just how secure we are as a nation in our in what we're fighting for. It feels I don't know. I think there is that sense of being fear driven and being it's almost like protesting too much in some ways, that we are the leaders. Like we really I think we aren't as strong a nation as we try to purport to be, and that's really bearing out now. I mean, that Chiron is ruled by Mars and Gemini, which is very divisive, very polarized, and kind of all over the place.
I want to comment directly on what you've just said, but let me just throw in here. Think of the number of people who have been in the news while Chiron's been in Aries who are Geminis. Men who are and one woman I can think of on a political front. But to get back to the general point about the U.S. you were making, I keep thinking Patrick Swayze in Roadhouse. Like, I'm just going to go beat the crap out of people because I have to. Yeah. And I think statistically, I do not know the number for this, but more years than not, the U.S. has been involved in a war somewhere for its entire existence. And that to me speaks to Chiron and Aries.
Definitely. And stirring up trouble and drama, using being driven by supposedly the need to spread democracy, but really just creating trouble for a lot of the countries that they go into. It feels like that concept of being the perpetrator and acting like a victim in some ways. Like that Chiron and Aries is really like the creating things, creating violence, doing things, and then acting like they are really just the savior, acting like they're really just here to help when they're really just creating more violence, more bloodshed, more chaos even in the process.
Wonderful. I do not argue with you. Now, at the moment, there's so many directions we can take this in. So we're having our Chiron return right now while we're also having eclipses in the signs of Aries and Libra. So Aries where our Chiron is, Libra where our Saturn is. And Chiron was conjunct the April 8th solar eclipse,
right?
Which is a massive reset coming.
Yep. Yes.
Any immediate thoughts about that?
Well, I think we still have to live out some of this eclipse at April 8th. I think it was so intense that we still have a ripple effect happening. I mean, it's hard not to talk about Donald Trump and him being, in the first criminal trial of a president, and not see this as somehow related to or connected to that eclipse cycle and the Chiron return, because if we look back at the last time we had this Chiron return, Nixon and Watergate was taking place. Our country was at a very vulnerable place. And I would say having the first time a president is being, you know, is in a is facing like prison. I mean, he's literally facing prison time. It makes us our own vulnerabilities, and the fact that in some ways this country can be its own worst enemy. That's another way I think of Chiron and Aries, right up front, in the same ways that if we look back into history, we had similar moments of great vulnerability as a country, you know.
I found it fascinating. I was aware of the Watergate connection, but if you keep taking it back 50-year segments, your research has identified some amazing things. Teapot Dome scandal of the 20s, the previously most corrupt administration that we know of in our history during that time. And then you can just keep taking it back. Massive tax fraud that was around Ulysses S. Grant's campaign.
Right. There was one that goes all the way to the beginning. It was like the first Chiron return. I'm gonna see if I can find this.
Oh, and that was taking it back that far. There was a bargain between the Speaker of the House and the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams,
that
ended up throwing the election to the House to decide it.
Right. Which is really interesting that this whole idea of rigging an election has come back around. You know, here we are so far down the line as a nation, and this is still part of our story. You know, I feel like it's about, you know, the validity of our systems. You know, again, we have this exalted Saturn in Libra, and this is the face that we show the world, that we are on the side of democracy and everyone having a voice. And yet we kind of put our foot in it every 50 years. We kind of show that, that's what we say. But in truth, you know, we're as corrupt as everyone else, you know.
And now we've got it in many places, Supreme Court even. So, and there's another aspect to this too. Excuse me, I was checking something on the screen there. Well, let's just talk about let's start with what we see going on now and then take it back incrementally to some big themes. One thing that has jumped out at me from the very beginning is the whole issue of gun violence. That seems to be an immediate association with Chiron and Aries, a wound having to do with aggression. And killing people. There we go.
Yeah, like even the weapons the weapon that is the most to blame for this being tied to the Chiron cycle as well. And here in Tennessee, we just yesterday they passed a bill to allow teachers to carry weapons into the classroom as a response to the shooting that we had around the very first in this series of Aries eclipses. So,
and that was when the two Justins and one other representative got in trouble for daring to talk about this on the floor, and the two men got expelled, and the woman is now running for Congress. I mean, for the Senate.
Senate, right. Yes. Yeah. So it was really clear here in Tennessee how this was playing out. And I did see a correlation between the placement of the full moon in Libra during this time happened to be in a similar part of the sky when the Confederate troops fired their first mortars over Fort Sumter, South Carolina, and started the Civil War. So it's just, you can't really make this correlation up of how significant some of the things that are going on right now, particularly around the argument of, you know, individual rights. I mean, I think that's part of a long history of the United States is, you know, we were founded on religious rights and the rights of the individual to worship their own version of God. And now it's come down to, you know, how much right we have to arm ourselves against each other, you know. And I think of that Chiron and Aries as well as like being our own worst enemy is very much coming up. This idea of, civil war was a theme. The areas of sky illuminated during this period of the Chiron return were also being illuminated during the Civil War. The Chiron return being playing a big role in Americans fighting Americans, and that coming up again now in terms of gun rights and how, what we think. I mean, this whole argument over what makes us safe and what we are entitled to as individuals in order to preserve our safety. And yet more guns keep getting filtered into the collective, and more innocent people continue to die because we think, we're going to fight fire with fire, that Aries kind of approach, when it makes more sense to, go into that Libra part of, finding some kind of consensus, finding some kind of peaceful middle ground where the killing stops.
And I think this is a good point for us to take our break. So stick around, everybody. We've got lots of really interesting historical corollaries a lot of you have lived through. So stick around. We'll be back. Welcome back to Celestial Compass. We're talking about Chiron in Aries with Gina Piccalo. And it seems to me with what we've been discussing so far already kind of butts in against or picks up on two interesting threads that run through the different Chiron and Aries cycles in the US. One has to do with the effect on women's role, and one has to do with the effect on Black people's roles.
That's true. Yes. Yeah. So in the past, we have seen this correlate with individual rights in general. So we had Chiron returning when in that Reconstruction period, in the aftermath of the Civil War. We had this taking place during Prohibition and the Flapper movement. We had this taking place during the birth of the abolitionist movement, was very much a women's movement itself. And so, the whole concept of who is entitled to what becomes a really big theme as this Chiron return is taking place. And in the 70s, this would have been a time when abortion was being legalized. And now we come 50 years later and we're back battling for reproductive rights again, unfortunately, on the other side of that. So it is really interesting to see this cycle and how it manifests. This idea of women earning the right to vote in the transit during 1920, of Black men earning the right to vote during the transit in 1870, and then that happening again during the Civil Rights Act of 1965. That was prior to the Chiron return of the 70s. But we're seeing again now this access to being able to vote coming up again, and the whole concept of elections being rigged and redistricting, making it more difficult for minorities to have the same access to voting that, white people have. It's just incredible that it's still honestly an issue as it is.
Well, doesn't this sound like insecure power going overboard and compensating?
Right. Definitely. Yeah. When we think about that whole concept of Aries needing to assert itself and going, way overboard in that sort of it is toxic masculinity, and women can assert toxic masculinity too when they kind of get on that train, and feeling so insecure about your power that you end up inhibiting everyone from having any say in anything. I think that is like this idea of the patriarchy. I feel like the toxic patriarchy is another manifestation of Chiron and Aries for the United States.
And yet, let's go back to the solar eclipse, because there was something really interesting going on April 8th with the lineup of a huge number of planets in Aries. So Chiron conjunct the new moon, and Mercury conjunct Eris at the end of Aries. Venus was basically in Aries. So we've got two warrior goddess configurations in Aries. And where was the ruler of all this?
In a swamp, in the swamp land.
In the feminine sign of Pisces, conjunct Saturn, which is opposite ours. So there's this weird, I see a weird empowering of the feminine to move it into like, okay, my turn vibe from it all.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about that as a feminist signature, but definitely feels a little bit like the feminist movement is having to, assert itself more strongly, and I think struggling to be heard through all of this loud Aries stuff that's been going on. But it'll be interesting to see how some of this unfolds in that series we have in in September and October, when we have the Pisces eclipse begin September, and then the other final Libra eclipse in October. I just wonder if all of that kind of leading up to the second activation, the second return. So we have November 8th is the second Chiron return. It'll be very interesting to see how these elections pan out and what factions end up being the loudest. And wouldn't it be interesting if the, feminist movement ends up having playing a strong role in what happens in the elections?
A time that may really play into this is May 29. Mars hits 19 degrees Aries on May 29. So it's going to move. The US Chiron's at what, 17?
20.
At 20. Okay, so it's going to hit the degree of the eclipse, and then it's going to hit the US Chiron right at the end of May.
Wow. Yeah.
Something is going to happen.
Well, what if that's when we get the verdict on the Donald Trump trial?
That's what I think. I think that's be the first verdict. I think there will be a second one at the end of August.
Really? That's
a Jupiter-Saturn square.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yep. But yeah, you're right. And look at what is going on with this. You've got the election interference aspect of this, which takes it back to the very beginning, the very first, with John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay.
Right.
And then there's also the woman element.
Right.
The fact that there are women who were told to be quiet.
Right.
And paid off to be quiet, which all fits in with it. It's just.
Well, that would be what takes him down, would be very interesting. The idea that it is a woman. And, I've been studying Donald Trump's chart really closely and hope to post some kind of research soon, but he has kind of his Achilles heel is in Cancer. He has a conjunction. I think it's let me just pull up his chart really quick, because it's
Saturn and Venus.
Venus. Okay. So you do have it.
And 25 Cancer.
Yeah. And so, that is really getting engaged by this Chiron return as well. It's getting that square. And in my research on Donald Trump, every single time something really tough has happened to him, it always activates that particular 12th house placement. So it'll be, it feels to me like his downfall is going to be coming from the feminine archetype in some way. And I think it ties into his own inability because of that Venus-Saturn conjunction. He has a very constricted ability to access his own love nature, his own connection with divine feminine, to go really esoteric, I feel like. And that is what is probably going to be his ultimate downfall.
Well, it would not surprise me. at all, at all. And I see that as his signature for that Saturn at 23 and Venus at 25 Cancer, as the signature for how he's made all his money. And the fact that his family, he got money from family, he squandered money from family, he pulls his family into his money making, and the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that happened in April was in a sextile to that, so it zapped it one way or another.
Interesting.
And it all fits in with our national collective karma, because Mars in the US chart is in Gemini, the ruler of our Chiron, and he's a Gemini, one of about 20.
And yeah, and you
The
know
cast
what?
of characters.
His sun is conjunct our natal, our US Mars. That full moon in Sag that he's born on lines up perfectly with that 21, because I know he's got 21 degrees. I'm pretty sure it's 21 degrees Gemini Sag.
Yeah. It's the moon, I think, is 20.
20, okay.
But the sun is 21. Absolutely. Yeah, it fits.
It's very interesting. Yeah. It's like you said, you can't really, it's incredible how these cycles present themselves. And it's so plain when you line it all up, that it can be somewhat validating, because you think, like, how did we get here? And then you just kind of map it back to the beginning of the country. And it's like, here, this is how. These cycles are just, it's all the same thing. We're just going through it in different timelines.
It's
Crazy.
what we do. Well, and how almost daily there is a new news report about this man or that man, and sexual allegations, harassment, sex crimes, did this. And it's almost astonishing how much of it is coming to light, but that seems to be a very, very hot area for issues in our culture.
Yeah, I do think that Uranus and Taurus, you know, has a lot to do with this kind of awakening, this feminist reawakening that has, you know, kind of continued since, you know, if you track back, I haven't done the research deeply on this, but 2018 seems to be about the time that a lot of this really epic revelation around sexual harassment and sexual, you know, assault that had been covered up for decades with Weinstein and Cosby and all the guys. It kind of, the Me Too started around that time. I feel like, you know, that we're reaching this moment where there's nothing that's going to be in secret anymore, that we would just have to move into this new era, because Uranus just continues to kind of hit these lightning strikes around that, you know, feminist principle of, you know, breaking apart some of these old ways of inhibiting, you know, women from being free, you know, being liberated, as they used to say. You know, we've technically been liberated, but the truth is that we've been held down by, you know, the patriarchy for all this time. We may be able to work in the workplace, we may be able to have kids when we want to, but we've still had to, you know, pay homage or whatever to toxic masculinity and the patriarchy. And I feel like this Uranus transit has really taken that apart and forced us to reckon with all the things that have been going on in the dark, you know?
Now we have even just survival issues at stake with state laws that are trying to override the federal requirement that an emergency room treat people. And if you happen to have a female body and your body is falling apart because of something going wrong with a pregnancy, there are justices on the Supreme Court who will be telling us by the end of June whether women have the right to live under those circumstances or not, or whether states can say, yeah, all right, this is the 21st century and this is where we are.
Yeah.
Okay. So while you were saying that, something else occurred to me, and that is that the governor of Florida has said that he has ordered certain Epstein records to be released at some point in June or July. When that happens, running a chart will be fascinating because by then Jupiter is going to be in Gemini.
Yeah. And isn't that a signature for scandal? I feel like I've looked that up before, like Gemini in general. And when Jupiter's going to trine that Pluto in Aquarius, I'm very curious how that might manifest, and bring again, as Pluto's kind of hovering toward the south node of the United States, there's clearly more that has to be purged, clearly more garbage that's going to rise to the surface to be, reckoned with in some meaningful way. But I've been looking forward to that Jupiter trine Pluto to see what comes of it, because that's a really big activation of Pluto in Aquarius that we haven't had yet.
No, and around that time is when Mars in Taurus is going to square Pluto, which is right at the very beginning of June. I'm not sure of the date that
June 11th. Yes.
But when does Jupiter trine?
So it'll be June 2nd that Jupiter trines
so
Pluto.
That first half of June ought to be extraordinarily revealing about what Pluto in Aquarius is going to mean for us.
I agree. Yeah, because Mercury will also trine Pluto June 4th. And Mercury will obviously conjunct Jupiter the same day. So there's definitely, room for a lot of revelation in the headlines and probably political scandal. I mean, I did not know that. I didn't know he had announced that. That's really
cool. Yeah. So watch for that. That'll be as soon as it hits the news, run the chart moment.
Well, and then Jupiter's going to conjoin the Uranus of the United States. That'll probably happen it's at 8 degrees Gemini. So I'm not sure that it's, before the election.
It's early because Jupiter will be at 17 by the end of August.
Oh, okay. So that'll be interesting too.
I think it's around the time of the Republican convention, isn't it?
Wow. Yeah, so it'll be interesting. It's going to be an interesting summer. Very interesting summer.
And yet, not as crazy as it's been.
Yeah, I mean,
that's my theory. I don't think it'll be as crazy as we've been through.
I think it'll be nice. I actually am looking forward to May, June, and July. I'm not crazy about August, but I think that, I agree. We're going to have a much easier summer. And I wonder if we see a lot more protests. I just wonder how that Jupiter in Gemini is going to light up the interest in not only getting out and getting back into the collective, but making your concerns known, like just a lot more interest, that Jupiter trine Pluto in getting out on the streets and, the power of the people kind of energy getting really, really emphasized.
That would fit. And that also reminds me, what sent people to the streets? A certain inauguration kind of sent things into insanely overboard. Mm-hmm. During Nixon's time, people were in the streets too. I mean, I'm old enough that I remember it. I was not old enough to be doing it. Mm-hmm. But different. And Jupiter and Uranus and Pluto were conjunct in part of what set that all in motion. So the fact that those guys they're in different places, but Pluto's under Uranus's domain because Uranus rules in the modern school Aquarius. I could sit here and talk about this for a long time. But it all kind of comes back to we're dealing with these core themes that come again and again and again, no matter what we do. Oops, there we are again. We've peeled layers off the onion. Oops, it's the same onion.
Yeah, it's so true. And I mean, I like to think that, we certainly have advanced along that karmic lesson of Chiron and Aries. I mean, women don't have to wear long skirts anymore. We do have the right to vote. Obviously there's still some things that, need to change, but I do think, the layers getting peeled do actually produce positive growth and results. But yeah, we could say that toxic masculinity is going to always be a theme that we have to reckon with in the United States. And this need to fight fire with fire, and gun ownership is probably going to be something we are always having to return to, reconcile with. And hopefully we get more advanced than we were in the Wild West. It doesn't, in Tennessee, it doesn't feel like that when you can open carry. It does feel regressive a bit where we're at right now, but hopefully it's also driving a lot of people who wouldn't normally show up at the state capitol and protest to do exactly that, and to do it very loudly. So, I mean, I think if Nashville and Tennessee can be an example of what happens when, things go on the wrong side, that will be a good thing. Hopefully it'll create positive change and more peace. We can only hope for that.
And I have the suspicion that it will propel more and more women to run for office. And won't it be a scream if we end up with I just remember when I went to law school, 1/3 of the class was women, only a third, but that was a big deal.
Yeah, for
then.
sure.
And I think that we're going to see the freshman classes in the House starting to skew much, much more toward women there.
I hope so. I really hope so. I think that's the future. I really do think that that's one of the things that this Uranus and Taurus transit is waking up women to participate, to take back their own future, and in a way that first has to feel like reconciling with how much they've been repressed. I think Uranus has to overcorrect a little bit. And, I don't know what Uranus and Gemini is going to be like. I'm excited, but a little bit scared. But I do think this Uranus and Taurus it started whatever wave we're on of feminism. We're in a new wave of it now, which is great.
And then Venus is going to meet Uranus in the month of May also before she, there is that, forget which.
Let's see. I've got my little almanac here. Yeah, on May 18th. Venus will conjoin. Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting because I wonder if some of what we see in May during the Gemini season and into June with Jupiter in Gemini isn't somehow the seeding of the awakening that comes with Uranus in Gemini when we get into, 2020, I think it's 2026. I mean, we have that beautiful grand sextile coming in 2025, but the future, we start to get indications of what Uranus and Gemini trine Pluto and Aquarius, sextile all the Saturn, Neptune in Aries. What it's going to be about. Interesting.
Yep. I'm putting my money on women being more in the driver's seat.
But that would be great. That would be wonderful.
Yep. Because, well, at any rate. Well, all right. We do have a tiny bit of time left. This is obviously not the only thing you think about.
Yeah.
What sorts of topics are generally on your mind these days?
Well, I'm just very curious about Donald Trump's chart. I think that I have been studying him since he went into office, really, basically since 2016. And just really curious about his karma and how he has managed to, avoid any kind of consequences up to this point. And so I've looked closely at his nodes and how I think he has the sun very close to the North Node.
Yes.
And Jupiter coming into Gemini, activating that conjunction. And so I'm just like, and plus I have a lot of friends who are like, when is he going to go to prison? And so I keep looking at that. That has been a big preoccupation. Every headline, every, new wrinkle. I'm studying transits. I'm studying his progressions and really curious. And I think that's why I've not publish the article, the research yet, because, I want to be certain about things before I make a forecast. And he's one of those who has defied all forecasts, So
well, we have lots we can talk about.
Yes.
I've looked into this a whole lot too. So
You
I
have.
certainly
Okay.
understand. Yeah, well, just know that the lunar eclipse was on his Neptune in the second house.
Yes.
Oh, gee, end of an era, maybe.
I saw that too, and I was like, something is disappearing, something is dissolving. I want so much for that to have that signature of. I like the idea of end of an era. I love that idea.
Well, let me add to this. Alvin Bragg's Pluto is exactly there.
Wow.
Again, we have a lot we can talk about. We'll take this off camera.
Okay, cool.
This has been wonderful. I would like you to tell people where they can find you and what you offer.
Yeah, so I see clients one-on-one. My main offering is my Patreon. I have a Patreon membership that's I offer weekly, monthly, and then just kind of dipping into cultural webinars stuff. So if you're interested in learning astrology, tracking your transits, I would encourage you to check me out on Patreon. And I have an Instagram account where I post, periodically. I try to get on there a few times a week about transits. And if you're in Nashville and you're interested in joining our astrology club, please find me, because we have a very vibrant community here, and a lot of people excited to learn and teach and practice professionally too. So that's all I got.
That sounds wonderful. Well, I thank you very, very much. Oh, and your Substack is
the Substack is called The Exalted. And I haven't published my Donald Trump stuff yet, but that's where it's going to go when it gets there. Yeah.
All right. Wonderful. Well, I'm certainly going to look for it, and we will have a conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy.
Thank you. I really appreciate you coming. And everyone, go read Gina's article about Chiron in Aries. You will just have your jaw hit the floor with the correlations and all the historical research. So I really encourage that. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking with you. And everyone stay calm. May is going to be different. And remember, you can find me at empowermentunlimited.net and also at Om Times and my YouTube channel, Professional Aquarian. So I will talk to you again soon.